10 Creepy True Driving Alone at Night Horror Stories. Story 1. The Scarecrow. I was driving along a country road at dusk, surrounded by vast fields of wheat that swayed gently in the wind. The sky was tinged with orange and pink, creating an almost idyllic landscape, but something on the horizon captured my attention and disturbed this tranquility. In one of the fields, by the side of the road, I saw a scarecrow. So far, no big deal. Scarecrows are common in agricultural areas. But as I got closer, I realized that there was something unusual about this particular scarecrow. It seemed larger than usual and was positioned strangely, almost as if it were watching the road. A shiver ran down my spine, but I kept driving, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that was starting to grow inside me. As I got closer to the scarecrow, the feeling of unease only grew. He seemed to be watching me, his button eyes fixed on the road, as if he was aware of my presence. What disturbed me most was the fact that, as I passed him, I had the distinct impression that his head was moving slightly, following the movement of my car. My heart raced, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I kept driving, but I couldn't help looking in the rearview mirror. The scarecrow was there, motionless, but the feeling that it had somehow noticed me made me deeply uneasy. That inert figure seemed to carry something dark and malicious. I carried on, trying to put the disturbing image out of my mind, but as I continued along the road, I began to notice something strange. At different points along the way, other scarecrows appeared, all similar to the first one. With each new scarecrow that appeared, the feeling of being watched intensified. At one point, as I passed one of them, I was sure that its head slowly turned in my direction, as if it were following me with its gaze. A shiver ran down my spine, and the feeling of imminent danger began to set in. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the further I drove, the more scarecrows appeared, as if they were surrounding me. Panic overtook me when, looking through the rearview mirror again, I saw one of the scarecrows in the middle of the road, exactly where I had passed minutes before. It seemed to have moved, leaving the field and positioning itself directly in my path. Speeding up, I tried to get away from that terrifying sight, but the feeling of being chased wouldn't go away. At one point, I spotted something even more disturbing. A scarecrow was standing by the side of the road ahead, almost as if it was waiting for me. I tried to look away, but morbid curiosity made me stare at the sinister figure. Its arms were outstretched, and I had the distinct impression that it was moving, as if it were preparing to catch up with me. Finally, as I left the rural area and reached a busier road, the scarecrows disappeared from sight, but the fear I felt continued to haunt me. I stopped the car at a gas station and got out, trying to catch my breath and calm down. As I remembered what had happened, I realized that something was wrong. I walked to the back of the car and, to my utter horror, found a scarecrow, the same one I had seen on the road, lying on the trunk, as if waiting for me. His tattered clothes and button eyes looked even more sinister in the daylight. Without a second thought, I left and never returned to that road. The experience left me with an irrational fear of open fields and scarecrows, as if there was always something lurking, waiting to move when I wasn't looking. Story 2. The Ghost Town. During a long drive, I decided to take an alternative route to avoid the heavy traffic on the main roads. The route took me through an isolated rural area, and as night fell, the roads became increasingly deserted. After a few hours of driving through winding roads and dense forests, I spotted a town in the distance. It looked like a good place to stop, rest, and refuel. However, as I got closer, I began to notice something strange. The city lights were on, but there was no sign of movement. The streets were completely empty and the houses, although illuminated, seemed deserted. A feeling of unease began to wash over me, but I still decided to enter the city, hoping to find a place to rest. I drove slowly into the city, looking carefully at the deserted streets around me. Streetlights illuminated the sidewalks, but there was no sign of life. I stopped in front of a cafe that seemed to be open, with the lights on and tables arranged as if they were waiting for customers. However, as I approached the door, I realized that the place was abandoned. The chairs were overturned and a layer of dust covered the counter and tables, as if no one had been in there for years. The feeling that something was very wrong grew by the second. I decided to explore a little further, walking through the deserted town. But every step I took was accompanied by an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the empty streets. As I walked through the streets, the strangeness of the city became more evident. The store windows were full of products as if everything was working normally, but the dust and abandonment told a different story. There were no signs of deterioration, but it was as if the city had suddenly been abandoned. At one point, I stopped in front of a house where the upstairs lights were on. The silence and the feeling of being watched began to weigh on me, but I couldn't see anyone inside. A morbid curiosity led me up the stairs that led to the porch of the house. When I reached the door, it opened by itself with a creak, revealing a perfectly tidy but empty interior. Fear began to turn into panic. What was I doing there? I decided it was time to leave, but as I walked back to the car, something even more disturbing happened. I heard voices whispering around me, faint and indistinct, but impossible to ignore. The shadows on the windows seemed to move, as if something was lurking in the dark. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the air seemed to get thicker and colder. When I finally reached my car and started the engine, the radio started playing by itself, emitting a disturbing static that quickly turned into a whispering voice, repeating a word I couldn't understand. The city, which had only seemed strange before, was now filled with a suffocating atmosphere of fear and despair. I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I accelerated out of the city, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the city itself was trying to trap me. The street lights began to flicker, and the voices on the radio became louder and more distressing. Panic took hold of me, and every kilometer I traveled seemed to lead nowhere. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I spotted the exit from the city and hit the gas. When I finally reached a main road, the radio went silent and the city lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, as if they had never existed. When I told a friend about it, he told me that the town was known for disappearing and reappearing over the years, always in different places. No one knows how or why, but those who enter it rarely come out unscathed. Since then, I've avoided unknown roads at night, fearing I'd come across that ghost town again. Story 3. The Abandoned Toll Booth. It was a summer evening and I was driving along an old road that cut through a mountainous region. It was a quiet and uneventful route, which I used to avoid the traffic on the main roads. As I progressed, the road became more and more isolated, with few signs of civilization. It was then, in the darkness, that I spotted a toll plaza ahead. The lights were dim, flashing intermittently, as if they hadn't been changed for years. The place looked abandoned, but the gate was down, forcing me to stop. I thought it was strange, but decided to get out of the car to see if there was anyone there, or perhaps an intercom to ask for the gate to be opened. The night was silent, and the air around us seemed charged with a sense of abandonment. I got out of the car and approached the toll booth, hoping to find some sign of life, but the place was completely deserted. The booth was small, with dirty, cracked windows, and it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I looked inside, but there was no one there, just an old chair and papers scattered on the floor. The place exuded a sense of abandonment that made me hesitate to continue. The road was deserted, and the silence was disturbing. I decided to try to lift the gate manually, but as I approached it, I heard a sound coming from inside the cabin. It was a low, rhythmic noise, as if something was knocking against the glass. My heart raced and a wave of dread washed over me. The sound was repeated, and this time it seemed louder, as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. Cautiously, I took a few steps towards the cabin, fear growing inside me. When I got close enough to see inside more clearly, a chill ran down my spine. There was an indistinct figure sitting in the chair, looking directly at me. It was impossible to make out details on the person's face, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Fear made me instinctively step back, and when I blinked, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. The sound, however, continued, now accompanied by a slight vibration in the air. Something was deeply wrong in that place, and I knew I had to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I got back into the car, determined to get out of that ghastly toll booth. But when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't respond. The engine made a muffled sound, as if it was being suffocated, and the lights on the dashboard started flashing wildly. Desperate, I tried again, but to no avail. It was then that the toll booth lights flashed one last time before going out completely, plunging everything into total darkness. The next instant, I heard a high-pitched, deafening ringing sound coming from inside the booth, as if something was being activated. I looked around, but there was no one, and the feeling of being watched intensified to the point of being almost unbearable. Then, suddenly, the gate lifted by itself without me having done anything. With the gate raised, a wave of relief mixed with dread washed over me. I finally managed to start the car, and without hesitation, I sped off, leaving the toll booth behind. My heart was still pounding as I tried to process what had happened. When I finally reached a nearby town, I stopped at a gas station to breathe and calm down. When the attendant heard my story, he visibly paled. He told me that the toll booth had been closed many years ago after a tragic accident that took the life of the attendant. Since then, it was said that the place was haunted and that people who stopped there felt a sinister presence. I've never been back on that road, and every time I think of the toll booth, a shiver runs down my spine. Story 4. The Black Hole in the Road. It was a dark, starless night, and I was driving along a deserted country road, trying to reach a nearby town. The route was familiar, but that night something seemed different. As I went along, I noticed a deeper darkness ahead, like a dense shadow blocking the road. From a distance, it seemed to be just a hole or a stain in the asphalt, but the closer I got, the stranger the stain became. It didn't reflect the light from the headlights and seemed to absorb everything around it. I slowed down, trying to understand what it was, but the feeling of discomfort grew with every second. The road, which had once been a simple travel route, now seemed to have turned into something much more sinister. When I finally got close enough, I realized that the hole in the asphalt was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just a depression in the ground. It was like a piece of the road had been ripped out and replaced by an absolute void. The darkness there was so intense that it seemed to be draining the light from my headlights, absorbing any attempt to illuminate its interior. The sense of imminent danger was overwhelming, and my instincts screamed at me to turn around and get out of there. However, something prevented me from simply ignoring it. It was as if an invisible force was pulling at me, forcing me to face that abyss of darkness. I decided to swerve to the side of the road, but as I tried, I realized that the car was losing power, as if the engine was being sucked into the darkness. The car started to slow down, even though my foot was pressing down hard on the accelerator. It was as if an invisible force was pulling the vehicle towards the hole. Fear gripped me, and I tried to turn the steering wheel to escape, but the car didn't seem to obey. The sound of the engine was muffled, almost as if it was submerged in something. I looked around for any sign of help or a logical explanation, but the road was deserted and the darkness around me seemed to close in on me more and more. The feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming, and the hole in the road seemed to pulsate, as if it were alive, waiting to swallow the car and me up. Desperate, I tried one last time to accelerate and get out of there, but the car was almost at a standstill. Then I felt a strange vibration through the steering wheel, as if the car was being pulled down into that black hole. Panic overtook me, and I began to hear a low, guttural sound coming from within the darkness, something that seemed to be moving there, waiting to swallow me up. I looked into the hole and, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving inside it, a shadow that was writhing and wriggling. At the last second, as if something had released the car, the engine roared back to life and I was able to accelerate out of there with my heart racing. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the black hole had disappeared, as if it had never been there. Even after escaping, the fear didn't leave me. I drove to a nearby town, where I stopped at a restaurant to try to calm down and understand what had happened. When I told one of the staff what had happened, he looked at me with a shocked expression. According to him, that stretch of road was known for strange phenomena, where drivers reported seeing inexplicable things and, in some cases, disappearing without a trace. No one knew for sure what caused these events, but many believed that something ancient and evil dwelled in that area, waiting to capture those who got too close. Since then, I've avoided driving along unfamiliar roads at night, fearing that I'd once again find that black hole that seemed to be a portal to something much worse. Story 5. The Viaduct of Shadows. It was late at night when I was driving along an old, poorly lit road that passed a viaduct known in the region for its haunted stories. The place was notorious among the locals for being avoided at night, but I had no other choice as this was the only route that took me home. As I approached the viaduct, the darkness seemed to become denser, as if the air around me was heavier. The car's headlights illuminated the worn concrete walls, which were covered in graffiti and vandalism marks. The silence around us was oppressive, and the only thing that broke the monotony was the sound of tires on asphalt. Something about that structure gave me the creeps, but I kept driving, determined to get through it as quickly as possible. As I crossed the viaduct, the feeling of unease intensified. The place exuded a dark energy, as if impregnated by something evil. The walls seemed higher and more oppressive than usual, and the darkness at the ends of the viaduct was dense, almost palpable. It was then that I began to notice shadows moving quickly on the walls, as if something was dragging or running across the concrete surfaces. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or the reflection of the headlights, but the shadows had distinct, humanoid shapes that moved in a disconcerting way. My heart raced, and the thought of stopping the car or even looking around seemed terrifying. I knew I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. The shadows kept moving along the walls, closer and closer to the car, as if they were closing in around me. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and the air inside the car seemed to get heavier, making it harder to breathe. I accelerated, trying to leave the viaduct behind, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The shadows began to take on more shape, looming menacingly over the car. One of them, taller and sharper than the others, appeared directly in front of the vehicle, as if it were blocking my path. Fear overtook me, and the only thing I could do was swerve sharply, almost losing control of the car. The shadow disappeared, but the feeling that I was being chased by something evil persisted. Desperate, I accelerated even more, but it felt like the car was being held by an invisible force. The road ahead seemed to close in, the shadows becoming denser and denser, as if they were trying to trap me there forever. The car's engine started to choke, and the vehicle slowed down as if something was pulling it backwards. I looked in the rearview mirror and what I saw made my blood run cold. The shadows had gathered, forming a dark mass that seemed to have eyes, fixed on me, shining with a sinister light. Terrified, I pressed down on the accelerator as hard as I could, trying to escape that suffocating presence. Then, without warning, the car shot forward, as if something had finally released its invisible grip on it. Finally, I crossed the viaduct and entered a more illuminated area, where the lights of the city were beginning to appear on the horizon. The relief was immediate, but the feeling of danger still hung over me. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, the shadows had disappeared, but their image was still etched in my mind. I stopped at a 24-hour diner, still shaking, and sat down to try to calm down. When I told the attendant what had happened, he looked at me with a gloomy expression. "You've encountered the shadows of the viaduct," he said. "They say they are the souls of those who died there, trapped forever, and trying to pull others to the same fate. Since that night, I've never crossed that viaduct again, fearing what might happen if I encountered those shadows again." Story 6. The Voice in the GPS. It was an evening like any other, and I was driving home from a meeting that had run overtime. The road was deserted, and I was using the GPS to find a shortcut that would get me to my destination more quickly. The suggested route passed through unfamiliar areas, but I trusted the GPS, which had always been reliable. As I drove along increasingly isolated roads, the feeling of being lost began to set in, but the GPS continued to give instructions as if everything was normal. What bothered me was the total absence of other cars and the darkness that seemed to close in around me. The road seemed endless, and the feeling that something was wrong began to grow inside me. As I followed the GPS's instructions, the feeling of discomfort grew. The roads it guided me along were increasingly deserted and poorly lit. The surrounding landscape seemed to repeat itself, as if I were walking in circles. It was then that I realized something strange. The GPS started giving me instructions that made no sense. It was telling me to turn down streets that didn't exist or to take paths that led to dead ends. Suspicious, I decided to stop the car to check the map manually, but before I could do that, the voice on the GPS changed. The female voice, which was normally clear and neutral, now had a lower, almost whispered tone, and seemed to be speaking directly to me, as if it knew I was beginning to doubt. The voice on the GPS, now different, started saying things that weren't part of the normal instructions. Instead of directions, it started mentioning personal details about my life, things that the GPS should never know. The tone was sinister, as if she was trying to manipulate me. "You're lost, aren't you?" the voice said, followed by a low, disturbing laugh. My heart raced, and I tried to turn off the device, but it seemed stuck, continuing to speak while the screen flashed with coordinates that made no sense. Panicked, I decided to head back to the last main road I remembered, but the voice insisted, "Go straight, don't swerve." The road ahead became darker and darker, and the idea of continuing was terrifying, but the voice seemed to have a hypnotic hold on me. Fighting against the growing fear, I forced myself to ignore the GPS and turned onto the next road I could identify, trying to escape that damned route. The voice on the GPS began to whisper faster, almost pleading, telling me that I was making a mistake, that I should turn back. The atmosphere around me seemed to close in, and the darkness on the sides of the road seemed alive, moving with the car. It was then that the voice shouted something incomprehensible, and the GPS abruptly switched off, plunging the car into an eerie silence. The road, which had seemed harmless before, now seemed like an endless corridor, and panic seized me. I accelerated, hoping to find some sign of life, but it seemed as if the road kept stretching on endlessly, as if I were stuck in a loop. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally saw lights in the distance, signaling the entrance to a small town. The relief I felt was immediate, and when I reached a gas station, I stopped the car and turned off the engine, trying to catch my breath. The GPS, now off, was silent, but the memory of the disturbing voice still echoed in my mind. When I told the attendant what had happened, he looked at me seriously and said that other drivers had reported similar things in the area, as if something was interfering with the electronic devices, taking people to unknown and dangerous places. Since that night, I've avoided using the GPS on deserted roads, fearing that the voice might come back, trying to guide me where I shouldn't go. Story 7. The Red Light. It was a quiet early morning and I was driving along a deserted avenue, returning home after a night's work. The city was strangely silent, and the few cars I had seen along the way had disappeared for miles. As I approached an intersection, the traffic light turned red, forcing me to stop. I waited patiently, watching the light, but it didn't seem to change. Time passed and the traffic light remained red, as if it were stuck. The total absence of other vehicles or pedestrians made the situation even stranger. I looked around, trying to understand what was going on, but the silence and darkness around me was oppressive. The traffic lights were still red and time seemed to drag on. Restlessness began to grow inside me, and the city, which had once seemed quiet, now seemed deserted and strangely hostile. The silence around me was absolute, and not even the distant sound of another car or movement in the street broke the feeling of isolation. I decided to look around, trying to find some sign of life or an explanation for what was happening. But the only thing I noticed was the dense darkness that seemed to extend beyond the limits of the intersection. It was as if time had stopped there, with the red traffic light becoming a kind of beacon for something I couldn't understand. With each passing minute, the sense of imminent danger intensified, and I began to wonder if I should just go ahead. As I pondered whether to go ahead at the red light, a feeling that I wasn't alone began to settle in. The air inside the car seemed heavier, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked around again, and that's when I noticed something that made me freeze. A hooded figure was slowly approaching the car, stepping out of the shadows on the sidewalk. The figure walked slowly but determinedly, coming straight towards me. My heart raced, and the survival instinct made me lock the doors immediately. The figure stopped a few meters away, just watching me. The traffic light was still red, as if it was forcing me to stay there, trapped in that situation. The figure didn't move, but the mere fact of its presence was enough to paralyze me with fear. Time seemed to drag on, and the figure continued to stand still, watching me through the glass. I tried to remain calm, but panic was beginning to take hold of me. It was then that the figure began to move again, walking around the car, slowly, as if it were surrounding me. Instinct told me to speed up and run, but something stopped me, as if I were trapped by an invisible force. When the figure finally reached the side of the car, it stopped and looked directly at me, but its face was hidden in the shadows of the hood. An indescribable fear gripped me, and then, as if time had thawed, the traffic light finally changed to green. I didn't wait a second and accelerated, leaving the figure behind. I drove as fast as I could, without looking back, until the familiar lights of the city enveloped me again, bringing partial relief. Still shaken, I stopped at a 24-hour convenience store, trying to catch my breath and understand what had happened. When I told the attendant what had happened, he looked at me with a serious expression and said that that area was avoided by many at night. There were stories of people stopping at that traffic light and never being seen again. Nobody knew for sure what happened, but the few people who escaped reported encounters with strange, unexplained figures. Since then, I've avoided that route, fearing that the hooded figure is still lurking, waiting for someone to stop at the red light. Story 8. The Night Passenger. It was late at night and I was working as an app driver to earn some extra money. The streets of the city were practically deserted, with few requests for rides appearing on my cell phone. I was about to call it a night and head home when I received a request to pick up a passenger in a remote neighborhood. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted the ride, thinking it might be my last before finishing my shift. I drove to the indicated location, a narrow, poorly lit street on the outskirts of the city. When I arrived, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, apparently waiting for me. I pulled the car over and opened the window, calling the person by the name on the app. Without saying a word, the passenger got into the back seat, and a strange feeling came over me. As soon as the passenger got into the car, a feeling of unease came over me. He didn't say a word, just closed the door and sat there, staring straight ahead. I tried to make conversation, asking him where he would like to go, but he just pointed to the address on the app. The strangeness of it all made me uneasy, but I decided to ignore it and start the race. The silence in the car was oppressive, and the only thing that broke the monotony was the soft sound of the tires on the asphalt. As I drove, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror from time to time, but the passenger remained motionless, his face partially covered by the shadow. The feeling that something was wrong intensified with every kilometer traveled. Little by little, curiosity and discomfort overcame me, and I tried once again to strike up a conversation. I asked him if he had lived in the city for a long time, trying to sound friendly, but the answer came unexpectedly. In a low, hoarse voice, he started talking about disturbing things, car accidents, tragedies that had happened on that very road. His tone of voice was cold and dispassionate, as if he were telling routine stories. With every word he said, a sense of fear and unease grew inside me. I wondered how he knew so much about those incidents, but I didn't have the courage to ask. The road ahead looked increasingly dark and threatening, and the desire to finish the race as quickly as possible grew stronger and stronger. Finally, as we approached our destination, the restlessness inside me reached its peak. I stopped the car at the address indicated and looked back to inform the passenger, but the back seat was empty. My heart almost stopped when I saw that he had disappeared without a trace. Fear took hold of me, and my mind tried to rationalize what was happening. I looked around for any sign of him getting out of the car, but the street was deserted. The idea that he could have left without me noticing was impossible. It was as if he had never been there. Trembling, I finished the ride on the app and decided to leave as quickly as possible, but the feeling that something supernatural had just happened wouldn't leave me. When I finally got home, still shaken by what had happened, I decided to look up the address where I had left the passenger. I discovered that, years ago, there had been a fatal accident in that area, where a person had died while trying to hitch a ride late at night. The shock was so great that I could hardly sleep that night, tormented by the thought that I had given a lift to someone who no longer belonged in this world. Since then, I've avoided working late, fearful of meeting another passenger who shouldn't exist. The experience left a deep mark on me, and to this day, every time I accept a ride, I make sure the passenger is real before starting the journey. Story 9. The car following. It was late at night and I was returning home after visiting some friends in a nearby town. The road was practically deserted, with only a few streetlights illuminating the way. Tiredness was beginning to weigh on me, but the thought of getting home motivated me to keep going. After a few kilometers, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror, a car that seemed to be following me. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it might be someone going in the same direction. However, as I continued driving, the car remained behind me, keeping the same distance, like a shadow that refused to disappear. A feeling of unease began to grow, but I decided to ignore it, thinking it was just a coincidence. As I drove, the presence of the car behind me became more and more disturbing. The road was long and straight, without many bends, which made it impossible not to notice that he was always in the same place, maintaining the same speed as me. I began to feel uncomfortable and decided to test whether it was really a coincidence or whether he was following me. I accelerated a little, trying to increase the distance, but the car behind did the same, keeping exactly the same distance. My heart started beating faster and a feeling of imminent danger came over me. I decided to slow down, hoping that he would overtake me, but to my horror, the car slowed down together, continuing to follow me like a shadow. The tension inside the car was palpable, and every kilometer we traveled seemed to extend that endless terror. I decided to change route, turning onto a side road that I knew was less busy, in the hope of losing the car. However, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that it had also turned, continuing to follow me closely. What scared me most was how perfectly he mimicked my every move. When I changed lanes, he did the same. When I slowed down, so did he. I broke out in a cold sweat and my brain tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The car felt like an extension of me, mirroring my every action as if it were connected to my vehicle in some way. The idea that something supernatural might be happening terrified me, but I couldn't understand how or why. Determined to find out who was following me, I decided to stop the car on a well-lit shoulder and face the driver. The car stopped behind me, and I watched through the rearview mirror, waiting for someone to get out of the vehicle. However, what I saw made me freeze in fear. The car was empty. There was no one behind the wheel, and yet he had followed my every move precisely. Dread overwhelmed me, and for a moment I thought about getting out of the car and running, but I was paralyzed with terror. The feeling that something was deeply wrong intensified, and the silence around me seemed suffocating. Then, without warning, the mysterious car switched off its headlights, plunging the road into darkness. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own car's engine, echoing in the silent night. That was all the impetus I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I started the car again and accelerated, trying to leave the scary vehicle behind. To my surprise, the car that was following me didn't move. I kept driving until I reached a busier area, where I finally began to feel safe. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the car had completely disappeared, as if it had never existed. Fear still haunted me, and every time I thought about what had happened, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The next day, I told the story to some friends, but they all looked at me skeptically, thinking I was just tired and imagining things. However, the experience was too real to ignore. Ever since that night, I've avoided driving alone on deserted roads, fearing I'd run into the car that followed me without a driver. Story 10. The Endless Tunnel. I was driving home on a rainy night after visiting relatives in another city. The journey was long, and the heavy rain made it even more tiring. The road was practically deserted, and the constant sound of the rain hitting the windshield was the only company. After a few hours, I spotted a tunnel ahead. It seemed to be a short passage, a way of crossing the mountains that surrounded the road. I entered the tunnel expecting to emerge on the other side in a few minutes, but as I got further along, I realized that something was wrong. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the further I drove, the longer it became, with no sign of an exit in sight. The feeling of being trapped in an endless place began to take hold of me. As I drove through the tunnel, the feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew. The tunnel seemed endless, and I couldn't see the exit light or even the end of the stretch illuminated by my headlights. Time seemed to distort, and every minute inside that enclosed space felt like an eternity. The tunnel, which at first seemed like an ordinary place, began to turn into something sinister. The concrete walls seemed to narrow and the sound of the tires on the asphalt echoed strangely, creating a disturbing cacophony. I began to feel that I wasn't alone there, as if something invisible was watching me. The road ahead stretched out like an endless line, and the feeling of being lost in a place outside of reality began to make me despair. It was then that I began to notice even stranger things. In the corner of my vision, I could see shadows moving along the walls of the tunnel, but when I looked directly at them, they disappeared. It was as if the tunnel was taking on a life of its own, distorting the space around me. The shadows, which were initially just undefined blobs, began to take on more defined shapes, almost human, but disfigured, as if they were distorted reflections of people. The sound that was once just the echo of tires on asphalt now seemed to be mixed with whispers coming from all directions, impossible to ignore. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to doubt whether I would ever be able to get out of there. With every kilometer, the tunnel seemed darker and more oppressive, and the fear of being trapped there forever began to take hold of me. Desperate, I began to speed up, trying to escape that endless prison. The car sped through the tunnel, but the feeling that I was just running in circles was overwhelming. Suddenly, the car's headlights started flashing and the radio, which had been switched off, came on by itself, emitting a disturbing static that quickly turned into whispering voices. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life, approaching the car as if they were trying to catch up with me. When the static from the radio turned into a clear voice that said, "You'll never get out of here," dread overtook me. I sped up even more, trying to get away from those words, from the shadows, from the tunnel that seemed to be closing in around me. It was then that I saw a faint light ahead, like a distant hope, and I clung to it with all my might. With my heart racing, I continued towards that light, which finally seemed to be getting closer. Speeding up, I saw that the light was the tunnel exit, which finally appeared ahead. When I passed it, I was immediately enveloped by the darkness of the night, but the fresh air and the rain falling on the car again brought me immediate relief. The tunnel was left behind, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never existed. I stopped the car at the side of the road, shaking with fear and relief. When I caught my breath, I looked at the tunnel in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was an ordinary road, with no sign of the nightmare I had been through. Ever since that night, I've avoided unknown tunnels, fearing that they might turn into supernatural traps, where time and space don't follow the rules we know.